The first key point revolves around the unsettling decay that had begun to consume Hollow Creek Plantation long before Clara Calloway's tragedy came to light. The story opens in a world already haunted, a place suffocating beneath the weight of its past sins and the slow rot of human cruelty. The air itself carries a thickness that feels unnatural, like a breath held too long by the earth itself. The plantation once thrived with life, its white-pillared mansion gleaming under the southern sun, surrounded by acres of fertile land and the constant rhythm of laboring hands that kept it alive. But time, loss, and madness had transformed it into something unrecognizable. This transformation is not only physical but spiritual, an infestation of guilt, grief, and decay that seeps into the soil, the walls, and the minds of those who remain. At the center of this corruption is Mr. Calloway, the plantation owner. He represents the dying world of the Old South, a man clinging to power long after its moral justification has collapsed. The loss of his sons in the war shattered the last fragments of his humanity. What remains is a man driven not by reason or compassion, but by the hollow echo of pride. His mind has turned inward, feeding on memories and madness, convincing itself that control can still be maintained through cruelty. The plantation, once his kingdom, now mirrors his descent. The crops refuse to grow, the slaves, those who have not fled, move like phantoms, and the once grand estate falls into ruin. The land responds to its master's spirit, decaying as his heart does. This connection between man and environment becomes a living metaphor, suggesting that the land itself remembers the injustices that have soaked into it. Within this suffocating setting exists Clara Calloway, the daughter whose life and body bear the heavy inheritance of her father's sins. She lives confined in her room, hidden away from the world and even from the light of day. Once cherished and doted upon, she has become an object of pity and fear. Her isolation has transformed her not just physically, but spiritually. The servants whisper that she no longer looks human, that her eyes reflect something unnatural, that her laughter no longer sounds like her own. In her father's delusion, Clara becomes both his shame and his possession, a symbol of his lost glory and a reflection of his decaying soul. She is the physical embodiment of the plantation's sickness, trapped between innocence and corruption, humanity and monstrosity. The plantation's atmosphere amplifies this sickness. Every detail contributes to a sense of dread that builds quietly, like pressure before a storm. The silence is not peace, it is the absence of life. The cicadas have stopped singing, the wind refuses to stir, and the night seems to hold its breath as if waiting for something inevitable to occur. The few remaining servants go about their work with downcast eyes, their movements mechanical, their faces stripped of expression. They are witnesses who cannot speak, bound by fear and by the invisible weight of their master's authority. It is within this oppressive silence that the story's horror begins to take root. When Mr. Calloway commands Isaac, one of the field hands, to tend to Clara, the act is loaded with menace and mystery. No one dares question the order, for questioning the master has always meant punishment or death. Yet the command feels different this time, tinged with desperation rather than authority. The master's voice trembles as he delivers his decree, his eyes hollow and gleaming with something unholy. It is as though he is not merely sending Isaac to help his daughter but offering her to some darker force that has already claimed the house. The boundary between madness and ritual blurs, and those who hear his words feel a chill that goes deeper than fear. They sense that whatever happens behind that door will not be human. The night that follows is the heart of the first key point's tension. Isaac enters the house a living man, but by dawn, something in him has shifted. The plantation feels it too, the air heavier, the light dimmer, as though nature itself recoils from what has taken place. The next morning, when the servants find Clara's window open and her bed soaked in something dark and unidentifiable, the horror becomes undeniable. The master's silence afterward only deepens the mystery. He does not scream or grieve, he simply stops speaking altogether, as though his voice has been stolen along with his soul. The house grows quieter, the rot spreads faster, and the remaining workers feel an invisible hand tightening around their hearts. Isaac's return to the fields marks the final transformation of the plantation's curse. He works as before, but his eyes no longer seem to see the world of the living. His hands tremble, his lips move soundlessly, and at night, he can be heard whispering Clara's name to the darkness. When the harvest moon rises, the truth, or something close to it, emerges. He is found barefoot in the cane fields, his skin glistening with a strange, ashen residue that catches the moonlight like dust from another world. Whether he is haunted, possessed, or broken beyond repair remains uncertain, but what is clear is that something unnatural binds him to Clara's memory. This first key point establishes the plantation not just as a backdrop but as a living entity, an ecosystem of guilt, madness, and decay. Every action, every breath, and every silence contributes to a suffocating tension that makes the horror inevitable. The sins of the past are not buried, they are absorbed into the earth, reflected in the bodies and minds of those who remain. The plantation becomes both a setting and a curse, feeding on the moral corruption of its inhabitants. In this atmosphere, even love, pity, and faith are twisted into instruments of doom, and the line between human suffering and supernatural retribution fades until they are one and the same. The second key point centers around the eerie relationship between Clara Calloway and Isaac, a connection born not of affection or chance but of desperation and darkness. When her father commanded Isaac to tend to her, it was not a gesture of mercy but an act of surrender, one that would blur the boundary between the living and the dead, the innocent and the damned. Isaac, a man who had already endured a lifetime of cruelty beneath the yoke of bondage, knew better than to question the master's orders. Yet as he crossed the threshold of the mansion that night, he felt the heavy stillness that seemed to hum through its rotting walls, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unholy to awaken. What he did not know was that he was stepping into a space where time had stopped, where the sins of the past had gathered like mold in the dark corners, feeding on the remnants of Clara's soul. Clara had once been known throughout the region as a child of beauty and laughter, the one thing that softened her father's coldness. But that was before the war took everything from him, his wealth, his sons, and his sanity. As his heart hardened, so too did his affection for her turn to possession. He withdrew her from the world, claiming illness, but the truth was far stranger. He could not bear for others to see what she had become. Isolation had swollen her body and clouded her mind, but her transformation ran deeper than the flesh. There was something in her eyes that unsettled anyone who dared look at her for too long, a quiet pleading that flickered behind a smile that never reached her face. She spoke in whispers to the walls, to things unseen, and sometimes her laughter drifted down the hallway at night, echoing in ways that did not sound quite human. Isaac had heard the rumors. The servants spoke of strange lights flickering behind Clara's window, of footsteps that moved when no one was there, of the master's voice shouting to someone who did not answer. He had seen the cross nailed crookedly above her door, the candles that burned long after dawn. The plantation had always been a place of sorrow, but since Clara's seclusion, it had become something worse, a place where reality itself seemed to bend. When Mr. Calloway summoned Isaac, there was no choice but obedience. The old man's eyes were hollow, yet within them glimmered a terrible kind of hope, as though sending Isaac into that room was his final attempt to bargain with the forces he could no longer control. The door closed behind Isaac with a sound like a sigh. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and candle wax. Curtains hung like funeral drapes, shutting out the moonlight. He could hear her breathing before he could see her, slow and ragged, as if each breath cost her a piece of her soul. When his eyes adjusted, he saw her sitting at the edge of the bed, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Her skin was pale and almost translucent, her eyes wide and shining with something that wasn't quite madness, but not sanity either. "Father sent you," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange calm that made his skin crawl. He nodded, unsure of what to say, and she smiled faintly, tilting her head as though listening to someone standing behind him. The hours that followed were marked by an unnatural quiet. Isaac tried to do as he was told, to fetch her water, to help her sit, to tend to whatever sickness had consumed her, but the more he looked at her, the more he felt the world shifting around him. Her gaze seemed to pierce through him, seeing things he had never confessed, memories he had buried deep. She spoke of dreams she had where the dead walked through the fields, whispering his name. She told him that the land was angry, that the soil beneath their feet was filled with blood that refused to rest. Her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and awe, and Isaac found himself listening despite his terror. It was as if she had become a vessel for the suffering that had soaked into the plantation over generations, her body an altar where the pain of the enslaved and the guilt of the masters converged. Then something changed in the air, a sudden chill that made the candles flicker. Clara's eyes rolled back, and her breathing stopped for a moment before resuming in a strange rhythm, like the beating of distant drums. She whispered Isaac's name again, but this time her voice was layered, as though more than one being spoke through her. "You have come to set me free," she said, and though Isaac tried to deny it, he could not move. His body felt rooted to the floor, his limbs heavy as stone. The walls seemed to pulse around him, shadows shifting and twisting into shapes that were almost human. Her hands reached out, trembling, and when her fingers brushed his skin, he felt a surge of warmth that burned like ice. It was not the touch of the living. Whatever happened next would haunt him forever. The screams were never heard beyond the door, as if the house itself swallowed them whole. When dawn came, the window stood open, curtains flapping in the weak light, and Clara was gone. The bed was soaked in a dark, viscous substance that smelled of earth and rust. Isaac stumbled out of the room pale and trembling, his eyes wide and unfocused. The master asked no questions, he simply turned away, muttering to himself as he retreated into silence. From that day forward, no one spoke Clara's name aloud. But the plantation did not forget. The fields grew colder, the nights longer, and Isaac began to change. He worked the land as before, but those who saw him swore his shadow no longer matched his body. Sometimes he would stand motionless for hours, staring at the mansion's upper window, his lips moving as though answering someone unseen. The other workers avoided him, fearing what lingered within his gaze. They said he had touched something that no mortal should ever touch, that Clara's spirit had passed into him, or that the plantation itself had claimed them both as part of its eternal hunger. Whatever truth lay behind the locked door that night, it bound Isaac forever to the curse of Hollow Creek, his soul trapped between guilt and grief, unable to escape the echo of her final whisper in the darkness. The third key point unfolds through the haunting aftermath of Clara's disappearance and the transformation that overtakes Isaac in the days that follow. The event behind that locked door is never spoken of again, but its consequences seep into every inch of the plantation like a slow, creeping poison. From the moment Clara vanished, the air around Hollow Creek changed, thicker, heavier, as if saturated with grief that could not be named. The sun seemed to dim, the soil hardened, and the once fertile land turned barren. The few remaining workers whispered among themselves, voices trembling with fear that what had happened was not natural, that something unholy had been unleashed. Isaac, once strong and silent, now moved like a man haunted by things unseen, his eyes clouded with the memory of something far beyond human comprehension. Every morning he rose before dawn and went to the fields, but his labor no longer resembled that of a man working for survival. It was as if he toiled for something else, some invisible force that demanded endless devotion. He stopped speaking, stopped eating with the others, and would often stand motionless in the mist long after the day's work had ended. When asked about Clara, he would simply look toward the mansion and murmur words no one could understand, his voice carrying an otherworldly rhythm that made those who heard it shiver. It became clear that Isaac was no longer entirely himself. The event had fractured his soul, leaving a part of him tethered to whatever had happened that night. Some said Clara's spirit had entered him, binding them in a macabre union that neither death nor life could undo. Others believed he had seen something so terrible that his mind refused to return from the brink of madness. Inside the mansion, Mr. Calloway had retreated into silence. He no longer issued orders or acknowledged anyone's presence. His days were spent wandering the halls, his footsteps echoing through the decaying corridors, his lips moving as though he were in constant conversation with someone invisible. The servants who still dared to remain claimed they could hear two voices whenever he spoke, one low and broken, the other soft and lilting, eerily resembling Clara's. The candles burned day and night, yet the shadows seemed thicker than ever, moving of their own accord across the walls. The portrait of Clara that once hung in the dining hall began to distort, her painted smile twisted over time, and her eyes appeared to follow whoever walked past, glinting with a strange, knowing light. The mansion's decay accelerated in the weeks following. Mold crawled across the ceilings, the floors groaned under unseen weight, and the mirrors cracked without cause. At night, a faint laughter echoed through the empty rooms, distant yet unmistakably human. It was said that Isaac, in the fields, would pause at the sound and tilt his head as if listening to a familiar voice. One night, he was found standing beneath Clara's open window, his hands covered in the same ashen dust that had stained the bed the morning she disappeared. When the overseer tried to pull him away, Isaac looked up with vacant eyes and whispered, "She's still here. She's waiting." The overseer struck him out of fear, but Isaac did not react. He simply kept staring at the dark window until the overseer fled in terror. From that moment on, Hollow Creek ceased to be a place of work and became a place of dread. The few who remained began to vanish, one by one, leaving their cabins empty and cold. The fields grew wild, the crops withered before harvest, and the plantation seemed to breathe with a will of its own. Those who passed by the property on the road at night claimed to see a figure in white standing on the balcony, her shape blurred by mist, her gaze fixed on the fields below. Some swore they saw another figure beside her, a tall man with hollow eyes, his hands clasped as if in prayer. The rumors spread quickly, and soon the Callaway plantation became known as Cursed Ground, a place where the living and the dead existed side by side in endless torment. Isaac's condition worsened as the months passed. He stopped sleeping altogether, his body sustained by something neither natural nor holy. His voice, when he used it, carried an unnatural calm that chilled those who heard it. He began carving strange symbols into the soil, arranging stones into circles that no one understood. When the preacher came to bless the land, Isaac refused to let him near the house. "She doesn't want your prayers," he said softly. "She's not at rest yet." His eyes flickered with both sorrow and devotion, a reflection of the bond that had formed between him and the force that once had been Clara. The preacher fled, muttering that the man had been claimed by something far beyond salvation. As the plantation decayed, nature began to reclaim it in ways that defied explanation. The trees grew unnaturally fast, their branches twisting toward the mansion like skeletal arms. The air carried a faint metallic scent, and at night, lights flickered among the trees, soft, ghostly glows that moved in patterns, as if guided by unseen hands. The wind carried whispers that resembled words, a chorus of voices rising and fading, their sorrow woven into the rustle of leaves. Those brave enough to linger near the property claimed to hear Clara's laughter echoing across the fields, joined by Isaac's low hum, blending into a haunting harmony that seemed both mournful and intimate. The sheriff who finally came to investigate found the plantation abandoned. The mansion stood hollow and collapsing, yet the parlor table was set for two, with candles still burning though no wax melted. Upstairs, in Clara's room, the walls were covered in markings, hundreds of handprints, some large, some small, pressed into the plaster as though made by ash. On the floor lay Isaac's shirt, torn and streaked with dirt, but no body was ever found. The townsfolk avoided the area from then on, crossing themselves whenever they passed the road that led to Hollow Creek. Some nights, they said, the air grew so still that even the crickets fell silent, and if one listened closely, a faint whisper could be heard, two voices murmuring to each other in the dark, bound forever in a love twisted by death and guilt. The plantation became a scar on the land, a reminder of human cruelty and the way it echoes beyond the grave. It was no longer a house, no longer a field, but a memory made flesh, a place where the sins of the living found a home among the dead. And though generations passed, and the name Callaway faded from records, the soil of Hollow Creek remained untouched, cursed by what had been done there, and by the restless bond between a master's daughter and the man she drew into her eternal nightmare. The fourth key point delves into the gradual unraveling of the Callaway legacy and the haunting permanence of what Hollow Creek became, a place where evil was not merely remembered but reborn, where the sins of those long dead continued to breathe through the soil and whisper through the walls. Years passed after Isaac's disappearance, and though the plantation had been abandoned, its presence lingered like a wound that refused to heal. The townspeople spoke of it only in hushed tones, warning their children not to wander near its gates, not to look too long at its rotting silhouette against the horizon. Yet some nights, when the fog was thick and the moonlight dim, travelers swore they could still see the faint glow of candles in the upper windows, flickering as if someone still lived there. It was as though the mansion itself refused to accept its own death, clinging to fragments of life born from suffering. The decay of Hollow Creek was not simple rot, it was transformation. The vines that overtook the walls seemed to pulse faintly at night, the ground beneath them soft and warm, as if alive. The sound of footsteps echoed through the empty halls long after the floors had collapsed. Nature had not reclaimed the plantation so much as become part of its curse, feeding off its dark history. The trees along the drive had grown into twisted shapes that resembled human forms, their branches stretching toward the mansion as though drawn to its grief. On quiet nights, the wind passing through them carried faint murmurs, soft voices repeating words no one could fully understand. Those who dared to listen too closely said it sounded like two people speaking in the distance, sometimes arguing, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying together. The legend of Hollow Creek became a cautionary tale, told in churches and whispered around fires. It was said that the land was cursed because of the master's cruelty, that the spirits of those who had suffered there would never find peace. Yet as generations passed, a strange curiosity began to grow. The children of the town, who had only heard the stories, began to test their courage by walking the perimeter of the old property. Some returned pale and trembling, insisting they had seen a figure watching them from the porch. Others claimed they heard the sound of a woman singing a tune both beautiful and mournful, echoing faintly through the trees. One boy who ventured too close was found hours later standing by the gates, unable to speak, his eyes glassy and fixed on something only he could see. When his voice finally returned days later, all he could whisper was a single phrase, "She's still waiting." As time moved forward and memory blurred into myth, the land drew the attention of those who did not fear its history. A wealthy northerner purchased the property decades later, intending to rebuild it into a grand estate. The old mansion was torn down, its bones scattered across the fields, but the workers soon found themselves plagued by strange occurrences. Tools vanished overnight, the ground shifted beneath their feet, and their animals refused to enter the site. Several men reported hearing whispers beneath the soil, faint voices calling their names. One man claimed to have seen a figure in white walking through the mist at dawn, her gown dragging across the ground though no footprints were left behind. The new owner dismissed the tales as superstition, until one morning he discovered his reflection in the mirror had changed, his eyes were not his own, and a faint shadow stood just behind him, smiling. Within a week he had fled the property, leaving it unfinished, and it remained untouched ever since. The story of Clara and Isaac, once whispered in fear, evolved into something almost ritualistic. Some believed they had become the guardians of the land, bound to each other in death as they never could be in life. Others believed they were not spirits of love but of vengeance, trapped in a cycle of anguish that kept them tethered to the plantation forever. Whatever truth lay beneath the myth, Hollow Creek stood as a monument to the consequences of cruelty and obsession. It became a place where the veil between life and death was thin, where emotions as powerful as guilt, fear, and longing refused to fade. People said the air felt heavier there, as though each breath carried the memory of those who had once suffered and bled for someone else's comfort. In time, explorers and scholars came seeking evidence of the supernatural. Paranormal investigators camped on the grounds, setting up their cameras and recorders, only to flee before sunrise. The footage they recovered was always the same: flickering lights, distorted voices, and a faint figure in the background, standing just at the edge of the frame. In one recording, a man's voice could be heard whispering, "You shouldn't have come," followed by the sound of distant laughter that made the blood run cold. Another team found strange symbols carved into the trees near the mansion's ruins, the same circular patterns Isaac had drawn in the fields before he vanished. No one could explain how they had appeared there decades later, their edges clean and fresh as though newly cut. The plantation's story spread beyond the town, drawing those who sought to understand its darkness or exploit its legend. Some came for answers, others for fame, but none left unchanged. A few never left at all. The locals learned to recognize the signs, the lights in the distance, the sudden silence of birds, the faint sound of humming carried by the wind. They said it was Clara's song, the same melody she had once sung to herself in her room, the song that had ended the night she disappeared. When it played, they knew another soul had crossed the invisible threshold, pulled into the grasp of the restless spirits that ruled the land. Through the years, Hollow Creek became less a physical place and more a presence, an echo that could be felt even miles away. Travelers who passed along the old road sometimes experienced dreams of the mansion before it fell, of a young woman standing at the window and a man in the fields looking up at her, their eyes filled with something that could be mistaken for love or terror. The dreams always ended the same way, with the sound of laughter that turned suddenly into screaming. Those who awoke from them never forgot the sensation that someone was still there, watching from the dark. The curse of Hollow Creek was not a story confined to its ruins, it was a reminder that cruelty leaves traces deeper than blood, that human souls can be bound not just by affection but by pain, and that some places never truly let go of those who suffered within them. The fifth key point captures the haunting legacy of Hollow Creek as it stretches beyond its physical decay, exploring how the evil born on that land refuses to die, how it seeps into generations, and how memory itself becomes cursed. What began as the story of one man's cruelty and one woman's suffering evolves into a timeless echo, a wound in the fabric of history that no passage of years can close. Long after the mansion had crumbled into dust and the last of the Calloway bloodline had vanished from record, the plantation's shadow persisted. The land stood barren, unclaimed, and unwanted, its soil still stained with the essence of what had taken place there. Yet those who wandered too close to the overgrown fields swore they could feel a pulse beneath their feet, as though something living and ancient slumbered just beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. The people of the nearby town grew used to the presence of Hollow Creek, though they never spoke its name aloud. To them, it was not merely a place but a curse that lived among them, shaping their dreams, whispering through the wind that passed over the hills. Those who had ancestors who once worked or died there claimed that the land called to them in their sleep. They would awaken in the night drenched in sweat, hearing the sound of chains rattling faintly in the distance, the echo of voices crying out for release. Some said the spirits of the enslaved still lingered, bound not by anger but by sorrow, unable to ascend because the earth itself would not let them go. Others insisted that Clara and Isaac remained as restless guardians, bound by their twisted bond, repeating the same unholy dance over and over until the world forgot them completely. As decades turned into centuries, Hollow Creek became an unspoken scar on the region's history. Scholars and historians came to study the plantation records, uncovering fragments of the truth buried beneath time's dust. They found references to Clara's strange illness, to her father's madness, and to the unexplained disappearance of the field hand named Isaac. Yet the deeper they dug, the less sense the facts made. Testimonies from townsfolk contradicted one another, the dates of events shifted as though time itself had bent around that place. One historian went missing after claiming to have found a hidden cellar beneath the old house, a chamber filled with carvings on the walls depicting figures locked in eternal embrace, their faces distorted in agony. His journal, recovered later near the property line, contained only a single sentence scrawled across the last page: "She has not forgiven him." By the late 20th century, Hollow Creek had taken on a new kind of infamy. Urban explorers, filmmakers, and thrill-seekers sought it out, drawn by the allure of the unknown. Each time someone entered its boundaries, the story seemed to grow darker. Visitors described hearing a woman's laughter that turned into sobbing, or seeing a man standing in the fields staring toward the ruins before vanishing into the mist. Some claimed their cameras malfunctioned, their batteries drained in seconds, or strange faces appeared in their photos. Others experienced vivid hallucinations, visions of the plantation as it once was, of Clara sitting at her window humming a lullaby, of Isaac's shadow moving through the cane with something glinting in his hand. These accounts became so frequent that even skeptics began to wonder whether the land itself was conscious, replaying its own memories like a wound reopening to bleed again. The curse of Hollow Creek did not end with the supernatural. It infected the living through fear and obsession. Families who settled near the area often fell into tragedy: fires that consumed their homes, illnesses that struck without cause, or madness that drove them to the edge. One local priest, determined to end the haunting, organized a ceremony to bless the land. On the night of the ritual, the congregation gathered with torches and prayer books, chanting verses to drive away the darkness. But as the final words echoed through the air, a wind rose from the fields, extinguishing every flame. The ground trembled, the air filled with the scent of rot, and a voice was heard, a soft, pleading whisper that said, "Do not forget me." The priest fled and never returned, leaving his rosary buried in the soil, where it tarnished black within days. Over time, the legend of Hollow Creek transcended its locality, becoming a story told in books, whispered in classrooms, and adapted into films. Yet every retelling seemed to awaken something within it, as though speaking its name gave it strength. People who read about it sometimes reported strange occurrences afterward, objects moving on their own, cold spots in their homes, or dreams of standing in a field beneath a blood-red moon. The story refused to die because it was not merely a tale, it was a reminder of the cruelty that had birthed it. It carried within it the truth that some acts of evil, once committed, echo through eternity, binding those involved to the place where it began. Hollow Creek had become a monument to human corruption, a place where suffering was transformed into energy, where guilt and longing wove together into an unbreakable thread that tied past to present. In the modern age, the land remains untouched. Developers avoid it, their plans always failing through strange misfortunes, machines breaking, contracts vanishing, workers quitting after seeing figures in the fog. The locals still cross themselves when passing its boundary, and those who live nearby claim that on certain nights the air grows thick and cold, and the outline of the old mansion can be seen rising from the mist, whole again for just a moment before dissolving into shadow. The laughter of a woman echoes faintly, followed by the low hum of a man's voice answering her. It is said that on those nights, the past and present merge, and anyone who witnesses it risks being drawn into the story itself, becoming another ghost bound to the cursed history of the plantation. Hollow Creek endures because it represents more than one man's madness or one woman's suffering. It is the embodiment of the past that refuses to rest, a living memory of injustice and pain that the earth itself cannot forget. The evil that was done there took root too deeply to die, and each generation that learns its story becomes part of the haunting. The plantation's curse is not simply a supernatural punishment, it is the weight of memory, the way cruelty echoes beyond the grave, and how love, twisted by fear and sin, can bind souls forever to the darkness they once tried to escape.